Welcome back. Our previous episode examined the paradox of Jewish selection. Not for righteousness, we saw how this created extraordinary resilience through systematic community organization. Today, we'll explore something remarkable: how these community networks evolved into global systems of influence, how scattered Jewish communities created the first truly international political and economic networks in history. This analysis will reveal specific mechanisms: how minorities became influential majorities in key sectors, why this pattern continues shaping modern international relations. Jews are scattered throughout the world. They live in many countries as absolute minorities, yet they identify themselves exclusively as a chosen people. They possess systematically determined tribal solidarity, unconditional internal cohesion, strong immunity to external influences, this internal trust and external distinctiveness, plus nomadic mediation as a way of life. According to University of California, Berkeley professor Hugh Slezkine, helped not only survive, but succeed in alien environments. Alienation itself became their profession. Isolation served as a means of maintaining distinctiveness. Loyalty concerned community members and their shared destiny, rather than territorial governments or local populations. Here's a characteristic feature: they lived in foreign lands according to their own charter. They counted on business ties with Jewish communities in the most distant countries and cities. The morning prayer declares, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has not made me a Gentile." The principle is clear. The incarnation of God's personality in a unified chosen people affirms special community identity in Judaism. When the entire nation is elevated, each member also acquires dignity through association. Even concepts of freedom and immortality are communal rather than individual concepts for Jews. For thousands of years, the most important quality of Israel's identity has been combining internal cohesion with external distinctiveness. Here's the key mechanism: the stronger the cohesion, the greater the distinctiveness. The greater the distinctiveness, the stronger the cohesion. The best guarantee of both? Ideological and uncompromising family solidarity, reinforced by a keen sense of divine selection and cultural distinction. The alienated mentality of Jewish communities scattered across continents became something unprecedented, a mechanism for forming what we must call a community network model of national political integration. This created something new in human history. Other peoples required territorial concentration to maintain political influence. Jewish communities developed distributed coordination across vast geographical distances. As they explored different regions, Jews became successful businessmen, bankers, financial sponsors, entrepreneurs. But this wasn't simply individual success, it was coordinated community advancement. In many countries worldwide, they entered circles of influence: ministers, deputies, administrators, advisors, media magnates, political consultants, lawyers, lobbyists, publishers, journalists, figures in science and culture, creators of the entertainment industry. The pattern is remarkable. Jewish communities didn't simply assimilate into existing power structures. They created parallel networks that often proved more efficient than official governmental systems. By forming corporate network structures around the world, they formed a highly influential part of the global political elite. These networks operated across national boundaries, yet they maintained internal coordination through shared identity and mutual obligations. In the age of alienation, they became the most experienced displaced persons. In the age of specialization, the most skilled professionals. In the age of capital, the most enterprising entrepreneurs. In the age of globalism, the most influential politicians. This systematic approach determines what we must recognize as monolithic subjectivity, national corporate kinship, communal autonomy, clan solidarity, internal cohesion, flexible political adaptability and creativity, historical continuity and integrity of all Jews as a unified identity of Israel, across spatial and temporal dimensions. Think about what this means practically. Jewish communities in New York could coordinate with Jewish communities in London, Paris, Vienna, St. Petersburg, creating international networks that transcended the limitations of any single national government. These networks provided several advantages. First, information flowed rapidly across vast distances through community connections. Second, capital could be mobilized quickly for investment opportunities anywhere in the network. Third, political influence could be coordinated across multiple governments simultaneously. Fourth, intellectual innovations developed in one location could be rapidly disseminated throughout the network. Fifth, threats to any community element could be addressed through coordinated international response. Faith, as a prior form of knowledge and understanding of material and metaphysical reality, has always been one of the deep foundations of their mentality. But this faith created practical organizational advantages rather than merely spiritual benefits. The network model proved extraordinarily resilient. When local governments changed, when wars disrupted territories, when economic systems collapsed, Jewish community networks could adapt and continue functioning. Why? Because they weren't dependent on any single political system. Traditional territorial powers might control armies and governments, but Jewish networks controlled information, capital, and intellectual resources. These proved equally valuable, often more valuable, in complex modern societies. This explains phenomena we discussed in our opening episode. Small territorial states with strong Jewish populations, like modern Israel, can exercise influence far exceeding what conventional analysis would predict. They're not operating as isolated territorial entities. They're focal points within much larger distributed networks that have been developing organizational capabilities across centuries. The corporate network model created several characteristics. These distinguish Jewish political organization from conventional territorial politics. First, long-term strategic thinking across multiple generations, rather than short-term electoral cycles. Second, coordination across national boundaries, rather than limitation to single governmental systems. Third, emphasis on intellectual and financial capabilities, rather than primarily military power. Fourth, adaptation to changing circumstances, rather than dependence on fixed territorial advantages. Fifth, mutual responsibility across the entire network, rather than loyalty limited to specific governments. These organizational advantages didn't emerge overnight. They developed through millennia of maintaining community identity while adapting to diverse political environments, creating unprecedented expertise in operating effectively within multiple systems simultaneously. Modern international business and political networks often follow patterns first developed within Jewish diaspora communities: distributed coordination, shared identity, mutual obligation, long-term strategic thinking, adaptability to changing circumstances. In our next episode, we'll examine how these practical organizational advantages intersected with intellectual and spiritual developments, creating what became the transformation of Jewish faith from vertical transcendent orientation to horizontal worldly calculation. How did communities that began with transcendent religious focus become primarily oriented toward material and political success? What were the consequences of this transformation for Jewish identity and global influence? If you're interested in how distributed networks create lasting political advantages, subscribe to the channel. In comments, share examples of other communities or organizations that achieved influence through network coordination rather than territorial control. See you next episode, where we'll explore the transformation of Jewish faith from vertical to horizontal orientation. Welcome back. Our previous episode examined the paradox of Jewish selection not for righteousness. We discovered how this apparent limitation created extraordinary resilience through systematic community organization rather than assumed moral superiority. Today, we'll explore a profound transformation: how Jewish belief evolved from vertical divine orientation to horizontal worldly calculation. This shift fundamentally altered Jewish identity and global influence. This analysis will reveal the mechanisms through which communities that began with sacred focus became primarily oriented toward material and political success. The Bible states clearly, "Blessed is the man who trusts in God and whose trust is the Lord." In Judaism, the model of belief is Abraham. He did not hesitate to give his son as a sacrifice to the Almighty. The unconditional and total emphasis on the text of Revelation allows us to define trust as the core psychological component of Jewish mentality. Trust, as the highest value, relates only to the divine principle, accepted and professed by all Jews on the basis of the texts of the holy books. In the biblical book of Exodus, the Creator addresses the chosen people. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Here, Egypt appears. If we follow ancient symbolic interpretations, as an image of the unenlightened darkness of carnal passions, from which one can emerge only by an effort of the Spirit, with trust in the Lord. Judaism resembles Islam and, to a large extent, Anglo-American Protestantism, in that it emphasizes not so much orthodoxy as lawmaking. That is, it focuses not on correct belief, but on orthopraxy as strict regulation and discipline of ritual, as strict ethical normativity and an incentive to right living. Halasha. Thus, in everyday activities, it becomes extremely important to perform a strictly regulated set of obligatory cult normative actions, rituals, which, as was assumed, make it possible to achieve righteousness formally by following the rules. Jewish tradition is characterized by greater attention to this world. Therefore, even divine concepts acquire a worldly, practical meaning. As a result, Judaism functions mainly as a system of social and political implications, which neglects the spiritual life of its community members. For every Jew, practical external behavior is always more important than internal sentiment and spiritual experiences. A Jew is primarily prescribed strict fulfillment of specific requirements of the law, which for centuries formed the attitude towards practical thinking and achieving specific results. The expectation of the Messiah is the central point of the Old Testament revelation. In the holy books, the Messiah is endowed with the highest status attributes: king, high priest, prophet. In some texts, he unites all these ministries in himself. But the most important aspect is that he is the Savior of all mankind, Jews and non-Jews, from sin, evil, and suffering, who will bring truth and justice to earth and establish the eternal kingdom of universal holiness, love, and peace. But, Professor Osipov writes, the Jewish priests, theologians, and teachers gave their people a purely earthly political interpretation of the Messiah. He will be the Jewish king, and the kingdom of earthly prosperity will come for the Jewish people. From here it becomes clear why the Messiah, Jesus Christ, was rejected for the teaching about his kingdom, not of this world. And the divinely revealed Old Testament system ceased to exist. The Jews did not accept Christ, who is love, truth, and life, who unconditionally rejected all political ambitions and prejudices against other nations. Therefore, they were not even tempted to use him for their political purposes, but simply killed him, using Pilate for this. Modern Judaism arose, which preserved in many ways the external, formal side of the Old Testament tradition, but lost its essence regarding divine selection. The understanding of it was also distorted in the Jewish people, since the most important thing, the conditionality of the selection by faithfulness to the Almighty in belief and moral life, was actually ignored. All the emphasis was placed on ethnicity, hence the conviction of the eternal inalienability of the selection, the affirmation of the national exclusivity of the Jews, their superiority over other nations. Naturally, such an idea cannot but appeal to the egoistic consciousness of man, and therefore it has taken deep roots in Jewish thinking. A convinced belief in one's own exclusivity, selection, according to the historian of Eastern traditions, Professor Vasiliev, contributed to the development of that adaptability, with which the sons of Israel found optimal forms of their existence after the turn of our era, when the Jewish state ceased to exist, and the majority dispersed throughout the world. Regarding spiritual ideas, they were initially interpreted within very broad limits. Disputes about the principles of Judaism are still ongoing, and opinions often diverge. For example, the problem of the afterlife of man and the problem of the Messiah are still understood differently in Jewish thought. As to what Jews must necessarily believe, opinions differ to this day. Nevertheless, sacred trust in Judaism acts as a value of the highest order. As in any monotheism, it becomes a phenomenon of superconsciousness for its followers. The basis of this trust remains unchanged over time. It is expressed by the concept of dogma. It serves as the basic system of prior knowledge about universal beginnings and the meaning of human existence. Scholar Losev's principle suggests an important conclusion. Judaism, as a sacred system of the chosen people, has become a real realization of a special mentality, as well as a fundamental, specific, and necessary self-affirmation of the personality of Israel in eternity. The people of Israel were distinguished by their aspiration. Their aspiration to connect themselves with absolute and timeless being, an imperative orientation toward ontological identity, and an attitude toward preventing the possibility of returning to flawed, adaptive, imitative existence. Over time, several factors led to an inversion of the principles of trust: the decline in spiritual reflection, the loss of ascetic energy, the transformation of the dogmas of revelation into secular national characteristics, and the growth of internal differentiation processes in the Jewish environment. Judaism received its first challenge to its ideas and principles during the Enlightenment. Jewish researcher, professor at the University of Wales, Dan Cohn-Sherbach, says that the monolithic system has been collapsing over the past 5 centuries. This process has led to the fact that, at present, the Jewish world no longer represents a single entity. Today, there is a wide spectrum of identities within Judaism. Since the 19th century, the Jews of Western Europe and then the United States have been caught up in intense processes: emancipation, secularization, politicization. As a result, sacred principles gradually began to turn into mere national cultural traditions. According to Professor Yuri Slezkine, instead of purity of the soul, a cult of purity of the body began to be established, as a result of which diet became the key to salvation. Jewish doctors began to compete with the clergy as specialists in immortality. The replacement of sacred oaths and divine law with written contracts and constitutions had a significant effect. It turned lawyers into indispensable guardians and interpreters, guardians of new universal values, and a new economic, social, and political order. The trust of the Jews, which began as the nationalization of the divine, ended as the deification of the national. The call of Erich Fromm, who came from a family of Orthodox Jews, for a spiritual solution to the equation of life to have or to be, was not heard by the Jews. However, not only by the Jews, the vertical of trust has transformed into a horizontal of earthly calculations, benefits, and desires. Sacred commitment has turned into what Sherbach politically correctly calls pluralistic Judaism, the principle of personal autonomy, the fullness of independence, and, finally, freedom from theism, which in reality are nothing more than a rejection of the dogmas of Judaism as the highest truths of existence. This transformation had profound consequences. Communities that once oriented themselves toward divine reality began focusing primarily on worldly success, political influence, economic advancement, social status. The systematic pursuit of divine truth gave way to systematic pursuit of material advantage. The discipline once directed toward spiritual development was redirected toward practical achievement. This shift explains many phenomena we discussed in earlier episodes: the development of global networks, the emphasis on education and intellectual achievement, the focus on political and economic influence. What began as vertical relationship with the divine became horizontal relationship with worldly power structures. In our next episode, we'll examine how this transformation from divine orientation to worldly focus influenced Jewish intellectual development. We'll explore the evolution from Torah to Talmud, and how this shaped distinctive patterns of Jewish thinking. How did the emphasis on legal interpretation and practical application create the intellectual frameworks that continue influencing modern society? If you're interested in how spiritual transformation creates lasting civilizational changes, subscribe to the channel. In comments, share your thoughts on how the shift from divine to worldly focus affects community development in other societies. See you next episode, where we'll explore Jewish thinking from Torah to Talmud.